In the summer of 1945, the war in the Pacific was finally ending. But for thousands of women trapped in its aftermath, freedom felt more like a death sentence. Among them were Japanese prisoners of war, many of them nurses and so-called comfort women, forced into sexual slavery by the Imperial Japanese Army. Captured after the fall of Luzon in the Philippines, these women believed the Americans would humiliate them, torture them, or worse. They had been told stories, propaganda that painted their captors as monsters. So when a U.S. Army truck rolled into their makeshift camp carrying wooden crates marked USO Relief Supplies, the women didn't see salvation. They saw another trap. What they didn't know was that inside those boxes wasn't food, wasn't medicine, wasn't weapons. It was something far more dangerous to their shattered sense of self. Lipstick. And it would change everything. Manila, Philippines, August 1945. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of burning debris. The city was still smoldering from months of brutal urban warfare between American forces and the retreating Japanese army. Buildings stood like broken teeth against the skyline, their walls pockmarked with bullet holes and blackened by fire. The Battle of Manila had been one of the bloodiest urban battles of the Pacific War, leaving over 100,000 civilians dead and the city in ruins. In a dusty clearing on the outskirts, surrounded by hastily erected barbed wire fences and armed guards, sat a group of 37 Japanese women. They were prisoners, technically, but they didn't look like soldiers. Most were in their 20s and 30s, wearing tattered uniforms or civilian clothes stained with mud and blood. Their faces were hollow, eyes distant, bodies thin from malnutrition and trauma. These were the forgotten casualties of war, women who had been dragged from their homes, their schools, their lives, and forced into a system designed to erase their humanity. Some had been nurses, tending to wounded soldiers on the front lines, their medical training twisted into service for an empire that saw them as expendable. Others had been teachers, students, factory workers, ordinary women whose lives had been upended by conscription notices that offered no choice, only orders. But the Imperial Army had another use for them. They were labeled comfort women, a sanitized term for sexual slavery, a bureaucratic euphemism that hid unspeakable cruelty. They had been sent to military brothels across the Pacific, from Burma to the Philippines, from China to the Dutch East Indies, forced to service Japanese soldiers who were themselves brutalized by war. The system was organized, documented, sanctioned by military command. It was slavery dressed up in official paperwork. Now, with Japan's surrender imminent after the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, these women found themselves prisoners of the very enemy they had been taught to fear. They had been captured during the American advance through Luzon, found in abandoned military installations, hiding in the jungle, or surrendering alongside retreating Japanese forces. They expected execution. They expected punishment. What they got instead was confusion. Lieutenant Margaret Sullivan stood at the edge of the camp, clipboard in hand, watching the women from a distance. She was a U.S. Army nurse, 32 years old, with sharp blue eyes and auburn hair pulled back in a tight bun beneath her cap. She had joined the Army Nurse Corps in 1942, driven by a sense of duty after her younger brother was killed at Pearl Harbor. She had seen her share of horrors during the war, tended to soldiers with limbs blown off, held dying men as they cried for their mothers, worked 18-hour shifts in field hospitals where the screams never stopped. But this was different. These women weren't soldiers. They were victims, and Maggie didn't know how to help them. She had tried speaking to them through interpreters, tried offering medical care, tried simply being present, but they looked at her with eyes that held no trust, only fear and resignation. They flinched when male guards approached. They refused to eat unless they watched someone else eat first, terrified of poison. They slept in shifts, never allowing themselves to be fully vulnerable. Maggie understood trauma. She had seen it in soldiers suffering from what they called shell shock, men who couldn't stop shaking, who woke up screaming, who stared at nothing for hours. But this was deeper. This was a trauma that went beyond combat, beyond survival. This was a trauma that had stolen their sense of self. Next to her stood Private James Chen, a 24-year-old Nisei soldier, second-generation Japanese American, who served as the camp's interpreter. He was thin, with wire-rimmed glasses and a nervous habit of adjusting them when he was uncomfortable, which was often, especially here. James had grown up in California, in a small farming community, where his parents had built a life from nothing. When the war started, his family had been sent to an internment camp, labeled enemy aliens, despite being American citizens. James had volunteered for the Army to prove his loyalty, to show that he was American, not the enemy. He had served with the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the most decorated unit in U.S. military history, made up entirely of Japanese Americans fighting to prove their worth. He had been transferred here because of his language skills, but every day felt like a betrayal. He understood the language these women spoke, but he didn't understand their silence. They barely looked at him when he tried to speak to them. To them, he was a traitor, a Japanese face wearing an American uniform. He was a living reminder of the complex, painful reality that ethnicity and loyalty were not the same thing. But they didn't see that. They saw only betrayal. Captain Robert Hayes approached, boots crunching on gravel. He was a no-nonsense officer, 40 years old, with a weathered face carved by years of military service and a perpetual frown that suggested he had seen too much and trusted too little. He had commanded prisoner camps before, dealt with captured Japanese soldiers who sometimes chose suicide over surrender, who had been indoctrinated to believe that capture meant eternal shame. But he had never commanded a camp like this. The women refused to eat unless they watched the guards eat first, testing for poison. They refused medical treatment unless a female nurse administered it, and even then, they often refused. They refused to sleep indoors, preferring the open ground where they could see anyone approaching from any direction. They spoke in whispers, if they spoke at all. They moved like ghosts, existing but not living. Hayes didn't blame them. He had read the reports. He had seen the documents captured from Japanese military installations, the bureaucratic records of the comfort women system, the cold, clinical language that described human trafficking and rape as logistical operations. He knew what these women had endured. He just didn't know how to make them believe they were safe now. How do you convince someone that the nightmare is over when they've learned that nightmares can be real? The Red Cross shipment arrived, Hayes said, nodding toward the truck parked near the camp entrance. Supplies for the women. Food, blankets, hygiene kits, standard relief package. Maggie nodded. Good. They need it. Some of them are malnourished, and the nights are getting colder. Hayes hesitated, his frown deepening. There's something else, some kind of morale package. Women's items. I don't know what exactly. The manifest just says reconstruction kits from the Red Cross Women's Committee. Maggie raised an eyebrow. Reconstruction kits? Some initiative from the Red Cross Women's Committee back in the States. Something about restoring dignity and preparing women for repatriation. I don't know the details. Just make sure they get distributed. Orders are orders. He walked away, leaving Maggie and Chen to unload the crates. Maggie sighed. Orders were orders, but she wondered if anyone back in the States had any idea what these women had been through, what they needed. Food and blankets made sense, but morale packages? Reconstruction kits? It felt tone-deaf, disconnected from the reality of this place. Inside the camp, the women sat in small clusters, speaking in low voices or not at all. They had formed a fragile community, bound by shared trauma and mutual protection. They looked out for each other, shared what little they had, and maintained a careful hierarchy that kept order in the chaos. Emiko Watanabe sat apart from the others, her back against a wooden post, staring at nothing. She was 28, but she looked older. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sunken, her hands trembling slightly even when she held them still. She had been a nurse once, in Osaka, before the war. She had wanted to help people, to save lives. She had studied hard, passed her exams, worked in a hospital where she learned to stitch wounds and set bones and comfort the dying. She had been good at it. She had been proud. Then the conscription notice came. She was needed, they said. The Empire needed nurses for the war effort. She would serve with honor. She believed them. At first, it was what she expected. She worked in a field hospital in Burma, treating soldiers wounded in the brutal jungle campaigns against British and Chinese forces. The work was hard, the conditions terrible, but she was saving lives. She was doing something that mattered. Then the orders changed. The army needed more comfort women. Nurses were educated, presentable, useful. She was transferred. She tried to refuse. They didn't care. Refusal meant execution for desertion. So she went. And everything that she was, everything that she had worked for, was stripped away. She didn't like to think about that time. She didn't like to think about anything. Thinking meant remembering, and remembering meant feeling, and feeling meant breaking. So she sat, staring at nothing, letting the hours pass like water. Near her sat Keiko Hayashi, the oldest of the group at 35. She had been a school teacher in Kyoto, teaching literature to young girls who dreamed of becoming poets and writers. She had loved her work, loved watching her students discover the power of words, the beauty of language. She had taught them about the great Japanese poets, about haiku and tanka, about the way a few carefully chosen words could capture the essence of a moment. Now she was here, trying to hold together a group of broken women who looked to her for guidance she didn't have. Keiko's face was hard, her jaw set, her posture rigid despite her exhaustion. She didn't trust the Americans. She didn't trust anyone. Trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. She had seen what happened to women who trusted the wrong people, who believed the promises, who let their guard down. She wouldn't make that mistake. She would protect these women, even if it meant protecting them from kindness that might be a trap. "They're bringing something," Harumi Sato whispered, nodding toward the truck. She was 30 with short-cropped hair that she had cut herself with a stolen knife, wanting to look less feminine, less vulnerable. She had a nervous energy that made her fingers constantly fidget, picking at the hem of her shirt, tapping rhythms on her knee. She couldn't sit still. Sitting still meant thinking. Keiko's eyes narrowed as she watched Maggie and Chen approach with a wooden crate. "Probably more lies," she said quietly. "More things they think will make us grateful." "Maybe it's food," Harumi said hopefully. "We could use food." "We could use a lot of things," Keiko replied, "but we won't get them from our enemies." "Are they our enemies?" Harumi asked. "The war is over. Japan surrendered." Keiko's expression hardened. "The war is never over for women like us." Maggie and Chen carried the first crate toward the women. The prisoners watched them approach with wary eyes, some standing, others remaining seated, all of them tense. Chen cleared his throat and spoke in Japanese, his voice careful, respectful. "We have supplies from the Red Cross, for you. Food, blankets, and other items. These are humanitarian supplies, not from the military, but from an international relief organization." No one moved. Keiko stood slowly, crossing her arms. Her voice was cold, controlled. "We don't want your gifts." Chen translated for Maggie, who frowned. "Tell them it's not from us. It's from the Red Cross. It's neutral. It's humanitarian aid. They're entitled to it under international law." Chen translated. Keiko's expression didn't change. "We don't need your pity. We don't need your charity. We need nothing from you." Maggie sighed. She had expected this. She set the crate down and opened it, pulling out a wool blanket. It was clean, new, olive green with US Army stenciled on one corner. "Look, I know you don't trust us, I get it. I understand why, but it's going to get cold at night and these will help. You don't have to see it as accepting anything from us. See it as taking what you need to survive. That's all." Chen translated. The women stared at the blanket like it might explode. They had learned to be suspicious of everything, to see traps everywhere. Finally, one of the younger women, Sachiko Ito, stepped forward. She was 22 with long black hair that hung in tangled strands around her face and eyes that hadn't focused on anything in weeks. She moved like a sleepwalker, present, but not present. She reached out slowly, her hand shaking, and touched the blanket. The fabric was soft, warmer than anything she had felt in months. Then she pulled her hand back as if burned, fear flashing across her face. Keiko put a hand on her shoulder, stopping her. "No, Sachiko. We don't accept anything from them. Not until we know what they want in return." Sachiko looked at Keiko, then back at the blanket, then stepped back, folding into herself. Maggie felt frustration rising, but pushed it down. She couldn't force them. She couldn't make them trust her. Trust had to be earned, and she didn't know how to earn it. She set the blanket down carefully and stepped back. "Fine, but the supplies will be here if you change your minds. No conditions, no expectations, just supplies." She and Chen moved to the next crate, this one marked differently. The label read Red Cross Women's Committee, reconstruction kits for female POWs and displaced persons. Maggie pried it open with a crowbar and paused, confused. Inside weren't blankets or food or medical supplies. There were small fabric pouches, bars of soap wrapped in paper, wooden combs, small mirrors, and small tubes of lipstick. Bright red lipstick. Maggie stared at them, genuinely baffled. Lipstick? For prisoners of war? For women who had been through hell? It seemed absurd, almost insulting. What were these women supposed to do with lipstick? Put on makeup while they waited to be repatriated to a country that might not want them back, that might shame them for what had been done to them. Chen looked equally confused. "What is that?" "Lipstick," Maggie said slowly, picking up one of the tubes. "They sent lipstick." She turned it over in her hand. It was a deep crimson, the kind women wore to dances and parties to feel beautiful, to feel human. The kind of thing that belonged to a world that felt impossibly far away from this camp, this war, this suffering. And then, suddenly, she understood. This wasn't about vanity. This wasn't about making these women look pretty for anyone else. This was about dignity, about giving these women something that said, "You are still a person. You are still a woman. You are still worth something beyond what was done to you." It was a symbol, small and fragile, but a symbol nonetheless. A reminder that there was a world beyond survival, beyond trauma, beyond war. A world where women could choose to wear lipstick simply because they wanted to, because it made them feel like themselves. She looked up at the prisoners, who were watching her with suspicion and confusion. She held up the lipstick, her voice gentle. "It's for you, all of you, it's yours." Chen translated, his voice uncertain. The women didn't move. They stared at the lipstick like it was an alien object, something from another planet. Keiko's expression turned cold, anger flashing in her eyes. "Lipstick? You think we want lipstick?" Her voice was bitter, sharp, cutting. "You think we are whores who care about such things? You think we want to paint our faces like dolls?" Maggie flinched at the venom in her words, but she understood the anger. "No, that's not. That is what you think." Keiko interrupted, her voice rising. "That is what everyone thinks. We were called comfort women, but there was no comfort. We were slaves. We were used and discarded. And now you bring us lipstick, like we are objects to be painted and displayed. Like we are nothing." Maggie shook her head firmly. "That's not why it's here. I swear to you, that's not what this means. It's not about making you look like anything for anyone else. It's about giving you something that's yours. Something that's not about survival or war or pain. Something that's just for you that you can choose to use or not use. It's about choice. It's about being a person again, not a victim, not a prisoner, just a person." Keiko stared at her, anger and pain warring in her eyes. "We don't need it. We don't need anything from you." But Emiko, still sitting by the post, was watching the lipstick with something different in her eyes. Something that wasn't anger or fear. It was longing. A faint, fragile longing for something she thought she had lost forever. That night, the supplies sat untouched in the center of the camp. The women ignored them, as they had ignored everything else the Americans tried to give them. The blankets remained folded. The soap remained wrapped. The lipstick remained in its crate. But Emiko couldn't stop thinking about it. She remembered the last time she had worn makeup. It had been before the war, before everything. She had been 21, going to a summer festival in Osaka with her younger sister, Yuki. They had borrowed their mother's lipstick without asking, giggling as they applied it in front of the mirror, feeling grown up and beautiful. Her sister had smeared it on crooked, and they had laughed until their stomachs hurt. That girl, that laughing girl with her whole life ahead of her, felt like a stranger now, a ghost from another lifetime. Yuki was dead now. She had died in the firebombing of Osaka in March 1945, along with their parents and thousands of others. Emiko had learned about it months later, through a letter that somehow found its way to her. She hadn't cried. She hadn't felt anything. She had just folded the letter and put it away, and she hadn't thought about it since. But now, looking at that tube of lipstick, she thought about Yuki, about the way she had laughed, about the way she had believed that life would be beautiful. Emiko looked around. The other women were asleep or pretending to be. Keiko was on watch, sitting near the fence, staring out into the darkness, keeping guard like she always did. Emiko stood slowly, her legs stiff from sitting too long, and walked toward the crate. Her heart pounded. She didn't know why she was doing this. She didn't know what she expected to feel. She just knew that she needed to do it. She picked up one of the tubes of lipstick, holding it like it might shatter. It was so small, so light, such a tiny thing to carry so much weight. She twisted the base, and the red tip emerged, bright and impossibly vivid against the gray and brown of the camp. She stared at it for a long time, this small stick of color that didn't belong here. Then slowly, she raised it to her lips. Her hand shook. She pressed the lipstick against her lower lip, feeling the waxy texture, the slight drag as she moved it across. She did the same to her upper lip, carefully, deliberately. When she was done, she picked up the small mirror from the kit and looked at herself. The color was shocking. It was alive. It was hers. She looked at her reflection, at this woman with hollow cheeks and haunted eyes and bright red lips. And for the first time in years, she didn't see a victim. She didn't see a comfort woman. She didn't see a prisoner. She saw Emiko. Just Emiko, the girl who had laughed with her sister, the woman who had wanted to save lives, the person she had been before everything was taken away. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden, and she didn't try to stop them. She cried silently, her shoulders shaking, the lipstick still in her hand. The tears came from somewhere deep, somewhere she had locked away because it was too painful to access. She cried for Yuki, for her parents, for herself, for all the women around her, for everything they had lost and everything they would never get back. Behind her, Keiko had turned, watching. Her expression was unreadable, a complex mix of surprise and pain and something softer. Then, slowly, she stood and walked over. She looked at Emiko, at the lipstick, at the tears streaming down her face, and something in her hard exterior cracked. "You look beautiful," Keiko whispered, her voice breaking. Emiko looked up, surprised, and saw that Keiko's eyes were wet too. "You look like yourself again." One by one, the other women began to wake, drawn by the quiet sound of crying. They gathered around Emiko, staring at the lipstick, at her face, at the color that seemed so out of place in this gray, broken world. And then, hesitantly, one by one, they reached for the tubes. Sachiko was next. She hadn't spoken in weeks, hadn't cried, hadn't reacted to anything. She had retreated so far inside herself that no one knew if she would ever come back. But when she picked up the lipstick with shaking hands and put it on, looking at herself in the mirror, something broke open inside her. She looked at her reflection, at this young woman with red lips who looked almost normal, almost human, and she broke. She sobbed, deep and wrenching, the kind of crying that comes from the soul. Keiko moved to her immediately, wrapping her arms around her, holding her tight, rocking her like a child. "It's okay," Keiko whispered. "It's okay to cry. Let it out." And Sachiko did. She cried like she hadn't cried since the day she was taken from her home, since the day her life ended and this nightmare began. Harumi followed, her hands trembling as she applied the lipstick. She looked at herself and laughed, a strange, broken sound that turned into crying. Then another woman, then another. Soon, all 37 of them were wearing lipstick, their faces streaked with tears and color, and they were holding each other, crying together for the first time since their capture. They cried for what had been done to them. They cried for what they had lost. They cried for the women they had been and the women they might never be again. But they also cried because, for the first time in so long, they felt something other than fear. They felt human. Maggie watched from a distance, standing in the shadows near the guard post. Her own eyes were stinging, tears threatening to fall. She had seen a lot in this war. She had seen death and suffering and cruelty beyond measure. But she had never seen anything like this. She had never seen the moment when humanity returned to people who had lost it. She pulled out her small leather diary, the one she had kept since the beginning of the war, and began to write by the light of a lantern. August 1945. Something extraordinary happened today. Something I don't think I'll ever fully understand. But I know I witnessed something important. We gave the Japanese prisoners lipstick. Just lipstick. Small tubes of red lipstick from a Red Cross care package. I thought it was absurd when I opened the crate. I thought, what are these women supposed to do with this? They need food, medicine, safety. They don't need makeup. But I was wrong. It wasn't about makeup. It was about something deeper. It gave them back something I didn't even know they had lost. Their humanity, their sense of self, their identity as women, not just as victims or prisoners or survivors. One of them, a woman named Emiko Watanabe, was the first to accept it. She put it on and she cried. She cried like her heart was breaking and healing at the same time. And then they all did. All 37 of them. They put on lipstick, and they cried, and they held each other. It was the first time I've seen them cry. The first time I've seen them look like anything other than ghosts. I don't know what happens to them next. I don't know if they'll ever truly heal from what was done to them. I don't know if they'll be welcomed home or shamed. I don't know if they'll be able to rebuild their lives. But tonight, in this camp, they looked like women again. They looked like people. And maybe that's enough for now. Maybe that's the beginning of healing. I hope so. The next morning, Captain Hayes walked through the camp for his daily inspection and stopped short. The women were sitting together in the morning sun, talking quietly, some of them even smiling, and every single one of them was wearing lipstick. The bright red color was startling against their pale, tired faces, but it was also beautiful. It was defiant. It was alive. He looked at Maggie, who was standing nearby with her coffee, genuinely confused. What the hell happened? Maggie smiled, a real smile, the first one she'd felt in weeks. They remembered who they are. Hayes shook his head slowly, but there was something like respect in his eyes. I'll be damned. I've been in this war for 4 years and I've never seen anything like that. Neither have I, Maggie said quietly. Private Chen stood nearby watching the women. One of them, Harumi, caught his eye and nodded. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable, but it was the first time any of them had acknowledged him as anything other than an enemy or a traitor. He nodded back, and for the first time since he had been assigned to this camp, he felt like he was doing something that mattered, like he was part of something important. The lipstick became a symbol, not just for the women in that camp, but for Maggie, for Chen, for everyone who witnessed it. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, even after everything had been taken away, there were small acts of humanity that could restore something essential. It wasn't about the lipstick itself, it was about what it represented. Choice, dignity, identity, the things that make us human. Over the following weeks, the women slowly began to open up. They accepted food. They accepted medical care. They began to talk, first to each other, then to Maggie, then even to Chen. They told their stories piece by piece, painful fragment by painful fragment. Maggie listened. She documented what she could, knowing that these stories needed to be told, needed to be remembered. The women were eventually repatriated to Japan in September 1945, transported on ships back to a country that had been devastated by war. Their fates varied and uncertain. Some rebuilt their lives, finding work, finding family, finding ways to move forward. Others never spoke of what had happened to them, carrying the trauma in silence because society didn't want to hear it, didn't want to acknowledge what had been done to its women. Many faced stigma and shame, blamed for their own victimization. But they all carried with them the memory of that moment when a tube of lipstick reminded them that they were still human, still women, still worthy of dignity. The incident was recorded in the 8th Infantry Division's reports in Manila, a brief mention in the administrative paperwork, buried in files that few people ever read. But Maggie's diary survived. She kept it for the rest of her life, and when she died in 1987, her granddaughter found it among her belongings. The granddaughter donated it to a military archive, where historians discovered the entry about the lipstick. And in those pages, the story lived on. A story about trauma and survival, about the things we lose in war and the unexpected ways we find them again. A story about 37 women who refused a gift until they realized it wasn't a gift at all. It was freedom. It was a reminder that they were more than what had been done to them. They were Emiko and Keiko and Sachiko and Harumi and 33 others whose names deserve to be remembered. They were women who survived the unsurvivable and found a way to reclaim a piece of themselves in the ruins. If this story moved you, consider subscribing to the channel, hitting the like button, and leaving a comment below sharing your thoughts. History is full of forgotten moments like this, stories of resilience and humanity that deserve to be told. By engaging with this content, you help keep these stories alive for future generations. Thank you for watching.